Good evening. I'm Steve Setchell, DePauw graduate, class of 1996. On behalf of my alumni engagement colleagues Nigel Bruce and Joel Bottom, here this evening I want to welcome you to tonight's session of the Virtual Alumni College. It's been an idyllic day on the DePauw campus. If we were meeting in person, I think this would have been one of those times where we would say, Dr. Stinebrickner, could we have class outside? But alas, we are gathering online and here in Watson Forum. And we're delighted to have 177 alumni tuning in online tonight for a timely topic and a well-known professor and quite a few students, faculty, staff among the election junkies here on campus. So welcome to all of you as well. Our speaker tonight is Professor Bruce Stinebrickner, who came to DePauw in 1987. He's a professor of political science. Earned his undergraduate degree magna cum laude from Georgetown and went on to receive his master's and PhD from Yale in political science. His research interests include, of course, the presidential nomination process, local American governments, career politicians in Australia. Dr. Stinebrickner, I didn't know this until today, but you spent 11 years at the University of Queensland in Australia prior to coming to DePauw. Never knew that. How did I not know that? But
life is full of ignorance.
Life is full of ignorance. Thank you. His topic today, of course, is the U.S. presidential selection process, looking back, looking forward. We're in for a real treat. This, by the way, is an encore. Dr. Stinebrickner gave a talk last spring in the middle of the primary process, and here he is following last night's debate. And just a little less than a month now before the big day, before the election. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stinebrickner. He'll speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, then take questions alternating from our live audience and from those online. Dr. Stinebrickner.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Joel Bottoms. Thank you, Larry. Thank all of the live audience here. Thanks for coming, and thank you to the internet audience. I don't need this. You heard Steve mention the 30 to 40 minute stricture, which is hard. There's so much to talk about. So I've got that I'm carrying that burden. I also don't want to repeat or try to compete with the endless and sometimes often very good TV and internet commentary by journalists. What I want to do is try to put into perspective some of the remarkable events of this campaign into a political science context, to integrate some of the events, particularly of the last 72 hours, the remarkable 72 hours in a remarkable campaign, into some of the things I was already preparing to say. So those are the burdens I'm carrying, but I'll live with it. I want to take the title of the talk seriously, The Presidential Selection Process, Looking Back, Looking Ahead. I want to begin by looking back and address the question of how did we end up with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump? Because that's where we are. And then looking ahead, I'm going to look ahead to how is this general election going to play out and how can we make more sense of it. So but the answer to the question of how did we end up with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump as the two major party nominees, really there's two facets to the answer that I want to address. One is the very unusual American party system, and the second facet is the very unusual presidential nominating process. And if you get just an elementary understanding of these two elements, it's quite easy to see how we arrived at Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump as our finalists for the presidential election. And they are really quite a pair of finalists. You probably know that their unfavorability ratings as a pair are the lowest by far of any pair of presidential candidates since the advent of modern polling. There is every reason to believe that whichever one takes office in late January 2017, he or she will have more Americans having an unfavorable view of him or her than a favorable view. That's never happened before. Presidents typically go into office, 65–70% of Americans have a favorable view of them when they take the oath for the first time on January 20th. Probably not going to be the case this year. So they are really quite a remarkable pair, and you might wonder what kind of party system, what kind of nominating system would generate two such unpopular people. Doesn't seem to make sense. Wouldn't you think that popular folks would be the candidates for president, the finalists? Let me explain. So let's begin by looking at thinking about the American party system. I want everybody to think just for a moment, what is an American political party? If this were a class, I'd have people write it down on a piece of paper or put it on the board, but just in your own mind, what is an American political party? You've all heard of political parties, obviously. But when you actually begin to think of what kind of definition you would offer, that's a pretty hard question in the United States. Because, this is my moment here. I'm going to... Because indeed the American parties are remarkably multifaceted and ambiguous. So if you had trouble in your mind constructing a definition of an American political party, don't feel bad about yourself. Rather realize the phenomenon that you were addressing is a difficult one. So take a look at this slide, the multifaceted and ambiguous nature of American political parties. And I've got 5 elements up there, all of which figure into a sophisticated and, if you will, accurate representation of what a party is. Let me run through them somewhat quickly. One notion or one element in American parties is the team or group of elected government officials. The Paul Ryans, the Mitch McConnells, the Joe Donnellys, the Nancy Pelosi's, all the members of Congress, all the elected state government officials who belong to a particular party. That's one conception of party, and indeed, that's a conception which we can't just throw aside. A competing conception or competing element is the party organization. By that I mean the activists, the volunteers, the Republican National Committee, the Democratic National Committee, the 50 state party committees, the party organization, the folks who at the lowest level go door to door and put leaflets in your mailbox. And at the highest level, there are people like the Republican National Chairman Priebus, who is riding this very, very difficult presidential, riding behind, dealing with this very unusual Republican candidate named Donald Trump. Another view is that the national conventions are really the core of the party. Those 2,500 Republican delegates or 4,500 Democratic delegates who meet every 4 years, this year in Cleveland and Philadelphia respectively, that really constitutes the core of the party. The fourth one is a little more difficult to wrap one's brain around, but there are those who would say the center of gravity in American parties are the coalitions of interest groups, the big donors, and or the intense policy demanders who are out there, if you will, seeking to exert influence and gain control of the party. In the case of the big donors, I'm thinking of George Soros on the Democratic side. I'm thinking of Sheldon Adelson or the Koch brothers on the Republican side. Warren Buffett on the Democratic side. These are people who literally give millions of dollars to either the party organizations of the states and the National Party organization and to candidates of the party that they favor. The intense policy demanders, I got that in quotes, that's a kind of a hot new term in political science, and it refers to, for example, the Bernie Sanders supporters, Think of the folks who supported Bernie Sanders. They weren't members of the party organization for the most part. They weren't elected government officials for sure. They weren't, at that point at least, delegates to the National Convention. But they were a bunch of people, lots of them, who thought that Bernie Sanders was the right choice for the Democratic nomination. Back in the 1960s, you might think about the anti-Vietnam War activists as being intense policy demanders who put tremendous pressure on the Democratic Party all through the late 1960s and early 70s. And then on to 5, those among the public who identify with a party and are inclined to vote for its candidates, sometimes called the party in the electorate. So we're talking about someone like Bruce Stinebrickner. Bruce Stinebrickner is not an elected government official, not a member of a party organization, has never attended a national convention, doesn't belong to interest groups, is not a big donor, and is not an intense policy demander. But if you ask me in private, which party do you favor or do you identify with, I'll give you an answer, and that would be the mass electorate component of the party. Now, you may say, what does this have to do with the presidential nominating process? Well, let me ask you this. Think about this question. Who should be the center of gravity of a political party? Who should control the presidential nominating process? Who should be the one who, if you will, lays a hand on the shoulder of a person and says, you are our candidate for president. You are our candidate for senator. You are our candidate for vice president. That is a debatable question, and in the United States, our presidential nominating process, as it currently exists, essentially lodges the power with number 5, the mass electorate. And there is no other political system in the world that does that. No other democracy, Britain, Canada, Japan, India, Australia, etc. None of them lodge the nominating process for the parties with the mass electorate. It is a peculiar American idea. It is a peculiar American practice, and it has drawbacks. In most, just as a side, in most Western democracies, the power of nominating candidates to the highest offices in the country typically are lodged with some combination, well, either just one or some combination of 1 and 2. That's how it works in virtually every other country, every other democracy in the world. Now you might say, how did we get to have this unusual system? Did we always have it, et cetera, et cetera? And the answer is no. And my test here. We have, through American history, had 4 eras in the presidential nominating process. During the first era, and I want to go through these quickly so that I can leave time for other discussion, and furthermore, this is a standard list. This is not my list. It's a standard list that you can find anywhere. During the first period, of course, as you can probably tell from the title, responsibility for nominating presidential candidates was lodged in the members of the party who occupied seats in Congress. So if you ask me who nominated Thomas Jefferson to be the Democratic-Republican candidate for president in 1800, I will answer the Democratic-Republican members of the U.S. Congress. And that's the standard, that's who did it. Very similar to our parliamentary system as they exist today. In the 1832 to 1908 period, the U.S. moved to this novel conception of a national convention. The National Convention was held every 4 years. The party organization people from the 30 or 40 or 13 or 50 states, depending how many states there weren't 50 in those days, met in a single place and chose the nominee. So it was very much the party organization folks gathered together to figure out who should be their nominee. The mixed system was a mix between national conventions were still used and continue to be used today, But the delegates for the national conventions were about 1/3 chosen in what we know as primaries, and about 2/3 from the party organization regulars. So that's why it's called the mixed system. And that lasted until 68. And then in 72, we went full-fledged to the unique mass electorate system of nominating presidential candidates. So we have, through our history, moved around, assigned responsibility for nominations to the different elements, but we have, since 1972, been stuck on what's called the publicitary model, the model involving the mass electorate. Do I have to suggest to you that Donald Trump, the embattled Republican nominee in 2016, would not have been the Republican presidential candidate had any of the other elements in the party had control? I mean, we know very well that Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and the other Republican members of Congress wouldn't have thought of nominating Donald Trump. We know very well that the Republican National Committee, headed by Chairman Priebus, would not have nominated Donald Trump, and so forth. It was only because of the mass public involvement of Republican and Republican identifiers and some independents that Trump became the nominee. And if you ask Priebus or Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell or Mitt Romney or George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush or Jeb Bush or Mitch Daniel, you keep naming Republican office holders and party organization leaders, and they would say, God, do I wish we had had a different system. That's not hard. That's not hard. So that's how we got here. We got here because we have an unfocused party system. I'll come back and close that loop in a second. And because we have a unique nominating process. I just want to close the party loop. So you say, well, if I was sitting in Britain or Japan or Australia and somebody said, write down a short definition of what's a party in, let's use Britain, it would be a much easier answer. The answer would be something like, oh, a party is the collection of all dues-paying members, card-carrying members of the party. In Britain, the two major parties are Labour and Conservative, capital C, capital L. So if you say to someone, are you a member of the Labour Party? They say, oh, no. Or yes, oh, can I see your card? There are card-carrying, dues-paying members. And that's the party. That's it. We're done. Oh, Stinebrickner, you're not a dues-paying Labour Party member? That's right. So then you're not a member. That's it. You're done. You're not part of the party. There's a very clearly defined group of people, and they, in conjunction with the members of the parliament who belong to the party, they too are dues-paying members, they control the nomination. They try to choose people who will appeal to the mass electorate, and they do. They presumably don't choose people like Donald Trump who are totally outside the system. And that's the way conventional modern democracies work, except for the United States. Okay, that's looking back. Now we can look ahead. So in looking ahead, I primarily want to focus on the question of who's going to win and why. Sounds like a good question. Not very hard right at this moment. But I want to put that, I mean, right now it looks like Hillary Clinton is going to win, especially given the events of the last couple of days. The data journalist Nate Silver, I think the last time I looked, which was about an hour ago, had her at 84% probability of winning. 84% chance that Hillary Clinton's going to win. I think that's probably about right. So you might say, well, how do we explain that? And here we're going to move through something called the four fundamentals, and then move to some of the peculiar features of the 2016 competition. The four fundamentals. The argument that underlines the four fundamentals goes essentially like this. There are pre-existing general societal and political factors that condition the chances of the Democratic and Republican nominee even before they're named. Let's call them a generic Democrat and Republican nominee. And these are developed by bunches of political scientists, and there's a vast literature which I will try to condense into about 5 minutes. One, the distribution of Democrats and Republicans in the electorate. Suppose I told you that 80% of Americans, this is not true, 80% of Americans identified as Democrats, and only 20% of Republicans did. Would you have any trouble predicting who was going to win the presidential election? You'd say, well, of course, if 80, I mean, we know that Democrats are much more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate than Republicans. If 80%, 20%, even if the Democratic candidate loses a few, he or she's still going to win, right? So the underlying partisan distribution is one of the fundamentals that conditions who's going to win the election. What does it look like in 2016? Well, it's a pretty even split. A slight edge to there's a few more Democrats. On the other hand, Republicans are more likely to turn out. There's a lot of independents, and some of them lean Republican and some of them lean Democrat. But the big picture is the first fundamental probably gives a generic Democratic candidate a very slight edge, maybe a 1-point advantage in a 40-minute basketball game. You know, we're going to start. You start with 1 point on the scoreboard. Now go out and play. It makes a difference. You'd rather have the 1 point than not, right, Luke? But it's not going to determine the game. We can still beat them anyway. Just a minor advantage this year. The economy and perceptions of the economy. This is the second fundamental that conditions how people vote regardless of who the candidates are. If the economy is going well and perceived to be going well, then the candidate of the incumbent president is advantaged. If the economy had 4% unemployment and growth was terrific and the stock market was going through the roof, the Democratic candidate, in this case Hillary Clinton, would have a substantial advantage. Let's take a look at the facts. The economy is sort of, right? It's the most sluggish recovery from a major economic setback ever. On the other hand, it's better than it used to be. Better than it was in 2009, better than in 2009. It is gradually getting better. What do the experts say? The experts say maybe, again, a slight edge for the generic Democratic candidate this year. But that's debate. Not a great edge. Presidential approval ratings. Why would they matter? President Obama's not running for election. Well, it turns out that what people think of the incumbent president casts a shadow or puts some sunlight on the candidate of the same party. If Obama was wallowing at 25% approval ratings, Hillary would be in a bad place. If he were running at 65%, which is very high for an incumbent president, the opposite would be true. Just take a moment to think about 2008. A guy named Barack Obama, a Democrat, was running against a Republican named John McCain. There was an incumbent Republican president named George W. Bush, whose approval ratings were in the low 30s, very low, very low. John McCain didn't have a chance. It's one thing, Luke, or if we give the other team 1 point at the beginning of the game. How about giving them 30? Probably not worth lacing up your sneakers. Go do something else useful. You're not going to beat them. John McCain was destined to lose because of George W. Bush's low popularity. Where's Barack Obama right now? Well, back in June, he was about even, 44 against. He actually has now moved up in his latest poll is 55% approval ratings, which is pretty respectable, and the average of the last couple of weeks is about 51 or 52. So probably, you're getting a little message here, probably a slight advantage to the Democratic candidate because of Obama's approval ratings. Although there are some political scientists say that what matters are the approval ratings in June, July, that by the time it gets to be August or September, it doesn't really matter where the president is because they've already begun to focus on the current candidates. Time for a change. The American public in general seems to have an inclination to swap Democrats for Republicans and Republicans for Democrats. Everything else being equal, you've had a Democrat for 8 years, Republican has an edge, and vice versa. So this one, the other three all give probably slight advantages to the generic Democratic candidate. This one gives a more substantial advantage to the Republican candidate. After one party has held the White House for 8 years, the research suggests that the candidate of the opposite party gets about a 1.5 to 2% boost. That's not 1.5 or 2 points, Luke. That's a nice boost. You go into a presidential election campaign with a 2% tailwind, that's a nice advantage to have. So that one would go to a generic Republican candidate. So if you add these up just loosely, 1, 2, and 3 slightly in favor of Dems, 4 more substantially in favor of Republicans, it's no wonder that people expected a competitive, close presidential election this year. No wonder. That's exactly what would have been expected, and that's what we seem to have until the last 2 weeks, and particularly until the last 72 hours. So, how to explain that the fundamentals aren't explaining what's going to happen? The answer is the fundamentals don't do it all. They set the table, so to speak, but the candidates still have to go there and eat and handle their knives and forks. Now, so let's move to the other dimension, the campaign, the thing we all pay a lot of attention to. We all pay a lot of attention to debates and evening newscasts about where the candidates are appearing and what they said and what scandals are coming out. The general point here is that those things typically don't matter much. Those things typically don't matter much. Usually the fundamentals set the table and the meal is complete. But if the fundamentals are close, then indeed they're likely to matter. Now, how can we explain then that the latest poll today shows that Clinton is ahead by 11 percentage points? I mean, they were virtually tied about 3-4 weeks ago. Clinton had edged out to 3 or 4 points ahead, and now, just in the last 4 or 5 days, because of the events we all know about, she's moved to 11 percentage points ahead, and it looks pretty good for her. How can we explain this? Well, this isn't a surprise. Donald Trump. Think about this. Think about a tug of war. Not a basketball game, Steve, but a tug of war. Think about a tug of war. You got this big, thick rope, and you got some kind of line, and you put 5 guys on one side. All of them are between 220 and 240 pounds and play football. And you put another 5 guys on the other side, all between 220 and 240 who play football. And then you blow a whistle and they start tugging. What happens? It's pretty close, right? It's pretty close. They tug and they tug and they tug and they tug. That's the way a typical presidential campaign might be viewed. That is to say, typically the candidates are both reasonably good candidates. Typically both of them have approximately the same amount of money to spend. Typically they go to debates and sometimes one candidate wins one debate and the next candidate wins the next debate, but there hasn't been time in American history where one candidate has been perceived to win all 3 or 4 televised debates. So typically a president, the candidates, the financing, the debate performances, the scandals or lack of scandals, the gaffes, all pretty much even out, and the tug of war goes on. And then if it's a close election, it becomes kind of flukish as to who wins. And in some ways, that's what seemed to be going on this year. 3 or 4 weeks ago, people like Bruce Stinebrickner and Nate Silver, that's good company, were saying, Hillary's about a 55 chance to win, or a 50%. I was saying 50-50. Nate Silver was saying 54% Hillary, 46% Trump. We were saying, hey, we just don't know. The tug of war is close. We just, maybe on November 1st, one of the guys in the tug of war is going to slip in the mud and twist his ankle. And that's going to be 4 versus 5. And then we'll know who wins. But who knows? Who's going to twist their ankle? Who's going to pull their back out in the tug of war? We just don't know. Well, Donald Trump, it seems, in the last 3 or 4 days, has done something that's unusual. He has made the campaign matter. He has turned what all the fundamentals suggested was going to be a fairly competitive race into what now looks like a fairly certain Clinton victory. That's unusual. We know that this has been a remarkable presidential cycle, so we shouldn't be surprised that something now remarkable has happened. But it seems that Trump has yet in another way blazed the trail. The first major party presidential candidate without any government experience. He's blazed a lot of other trails, which I won't bore you with because you know them all. You know enough of them. He's made comments and made suggestions and had videotapes released of kind of unprecedented nature. And now he actually seems to be the guy who has turned the fundamentals on their head and turned what ought to be a close game into a, if not quite a romp, of something close to a blowout. That's my pitch. One more thing I've got to say. I'm at 30. One more looking ahead. If I were smart, I could go back to the title. Looking back, looking ahead. I want to do one more looking ahead, and then I'll conclude. That will be my conclusion. I talk about the presidential election quite a bit with friends. I give lectures, I teach it, I write about it, I do stuff like that. So it's not unusual when someone approaches me, a friend, somebody, a Greencastle acquaintance, I'm in the grocery store. It's not unusual. And this year I've got a lot of expressions of, shall I say, discontent, unhappiness with the way the election campaign has turned out, and I suspect there's a lot of people in this room, myself included, who feel that too. It hasn't been a particularly inspiring or edifying campaign. And then they typically say, well, at least on November 8th we'll know. Remember, a majority of Americans have an unfavorable view of Clinton and an unfavorable view of Trump. So that's the typical American. They don't think very highly of either of them. They say, well, my God, on November 8th, at least it'll be over, and I can get some peace. And my response to them, which I'm going to give now, is, yeah, take a break from November 9th till January 20th. November the 9th, the day after the election. We'll presumably know who won by then. And just, you can just relax. But when the January 20th comes and the new president, be he Trump or be she Clinton, now looks like Clinton, remember, this candidate is going to likely be going into office with the majority of Americans having an unfavorable view. That's never happened. We've never had a person enter the White House on January 20th with the majority of Americans having an unfavorable view. Typically, the opposite happens. Typically, a candidate wins, and let's say he gets 51% of the vote or 48% of the vote with third parties, and maybe 54% of the vote. Usually in fact, I have some figures on this, which I'll share with you. How about Barack Obama, 2008? Barack Obama, on November 9th, 2008, that was a few days after the election, in a Gallup poll was said to have 68% of Americans having a favorable view of him. About 56% had voted for him, but you can vote against someone and still have a favorable view. So he was at 68% shortly after the election. By the time he took office, he had gained 16 percentage points, and he was up in the high 70s, low 80s. So that's a nice way to start a presidency, and it's a somewhat typical way. Typically, the folks who voted for the candidate like him. Typically, some of the folks who voted against the candidate like him. Typically, the popularity or favorability ratings increase between Election Day and January 20th, and then we have the so-called honeymoon period, where everybody is kind of, everybody's singing Kumbaya about the new president. It's kind of a nice time. Probably not going to happen this time. Probably not going to happen. We are probably going to have Hillary Clinton in the White House on January 20th, and maybe her favorability ratings will creep up to 55%, 53%. Maybe. They're now, if you want to know, as of today, 44% of Americans view her favorably as of today. She is creeping up a bit, and maybe in comparison with Trump, whose favorability ratings are going down. They're going down from the last figure. They were at about 30. They were at 41 favorability ratings. They're now in the mid-30s. So it's possible Hillary will creep up a bit, and maybe I'll be proven wrong. Maybe there will be a kind of era of good feelings about Hillary Clinton, the new president, between November 8th and January 20th, and she'll enter with something resembling a honeymoon. But I wouldn't bet on it. So if you want to take a vacation from politics and kind of relax, take a deep breath between November 8th and January 20th, because I think we're in for a tumultuous presidency, be it Clinton or Trump. That's what I have to say. Looking back and looking ahead, although my crystal ball does have some clouds in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Stinebrickner. We'll go online for our first question. Ryan Heeb, class of 2014. After the nomination of Donald Trump by the RNC, how do you think the presidential nominee selection process will change? Will it move away from selection by the public toward a model whereby party elites select the nominee?
Nice question. Thank you, Ryan. There has been some talk in the Republican Party, at the National Convention and in the committee, about moving a little bit away from the plebiscitary model. Some of you may have heard the term superdelegates in the context of the Democratic nominating process. I got the number. I think it's 15 to 20% of Democratic delegates are indeed, I can go back to my arrow again, are indeed folks from 1 and 2. There's about 15 or 20% of the delegates at the Democratic National Convention who get there automatically because they are Democratic members of Congress, Democratic governors or lieutenant governors, state party chairman and vice chairman, and members of the Democratic National Committee. That's 1 and 2. So they were introduced in the early 80s to leaven the process after the Democrats had an unpalatable nominee in 1972. The Democrats said, wait a minute, this guy George McGovern shouldn't have been our nominee. He was a terrible nominee for our party. Let's try to leaven the process. Let's try to introduce some, if you will, adults among the children. So what I think will happen, Ryan Heeb, is the Republicans will seek to do that. They will seek to introduce the equivalent of superdelegates. They'll probably introduce as many as they can, and if the Trump fiasco, if Trump does not win the presidency, loses by 10 or 15%, which seems possible now, this might be a fertile opportunity to do that. But it's difficult to roll back democracy, because think of the opposite argument. You're taking away our rights. You're taking away our rights. Don't do that. People will be in the streets protesting. They'll probably go ahead and do it. He's the question master, not me.
What do you think some of the implications of these unprecedentedly low approval ratings for the president, assuming that a majority of Americans don't like them for 4 years?
What are the implications?
Yes.
Well, I've already suggested in the short run, a relatively short run, a difficult presidency. I also should say that it may not be entirely a result of Trump and Clinton. There is a theory out there among communication folks which makes some sense that in this 24/7 news cycle era, the Twitter Instagram, etc., Facebook stuff, that there just won't be popular public figures in politics anymore. That everybody, the guy or woman running for president in 2024 will have unfavorable ratings, sort of like Trump or Clinton, and not like Reagan and Carter, back in the 1980s. It's a function of the new technology. So that, and then in turn, somehow we as a political system and we as a government and we as a society are going to have to adjust to that. So that's sort of responsive to your question, I hope.
We'll go back online to Celia Kauth, class of 2015. Do you believe Mr. Trump is setting a precedent for future candidates regarding behavior and campaign financing? Do you see his candidacy as an anomaly, or can we see, should we expect to see more candidates like him and some kind of a shift of political culture?
My crystal ball is very cloudy, but I think if indeed this plays out as it looks like it's going to play out, as a somewhat discouraging Republican defeat. Remember, this is a year that's pretty evenly balanced. Losing by 10%, John McCain losing by 8 or 10% in 2008 wasn't a disgrace to John McCain and wasn't a big surprise. This is a year that should have been competitive. This is like losing a basketball game that's supposed to be competitive by 25 points. This is not so. I think if that happens, maybe this kind of behavior will be seen as being, it is anomalous, and be seen as unproductive. I think the worst case would have been if indeed he somehow had won the presidency, which is still possible. Then indeed you'd say, gosh, I'm going to behave like that too because it worked. Right now it looks like it's not working. For those of you who don't want this kind of behavior, a commonplace practice in campaigns, for no other reason, you should then root for Hillary Clinton.
Given what happened with this cycle, with, on the Republican side, 16 candidates to start out with, on the Democratic side, formidable insurgency in the person of Bernie Sanders, resulting in the two candidates that we have left, what do you think are the chances going forward of a viable third-party candidacy, a third-party upsurge, or maybe even multiple parties, which would make us more like our neighbors in Europe and elsewhere?
And you didn't say, but maybe buried into your question could be, or even the breakup of one of the established parties. Right. Okay, my answer is small, okay. Very small. The two parties, the Republicans are going to break up. Now, I think we've had these same two parties since 1860. They've gone through stuff again. I think for the rest of your lifetime, Chris, and mine, we're still going to have the same two parties.
Extending beyond the nomination process a bit here, Karen Cockrell Anderson, class of '89. How would you encourage qualified, intelligent people, especially young people, to seek office after the vitriol and toxic campaigning of 2016?
Well, is it my job to encourage them? I guess.
Yes.
If I were to, I would say to them, because government's an important human activity. Government is a very important human activity, and if good folks don't seek office and gain office, then presumably less good folks are. So altruism, I would say, be altruistic, suck it up, go run for office, suck it up. And this is an extraordinary case. I mean, most folks don't have to run in a campaigns of this sort.
Tim Gale, class of 1990, writes, please speculate about the future of the top two primary system as used in California. Will we see more of that among other states?
Oh, the top two nonpartisan. Please speculate. That's an open invitation to a college professor. I think probably not much more of that. So in California, it's not so much, as I understand, not so much a Democrat versus Republican primary, but rather a primary where the top two candidates then become the finalists. I don't think that'll spread to other states. And if I had my druthers, and this is a radical view from Steiner, I would just abolish primaries altogether. Primaries were a early 20th century, early 20th century innovation, which I think have in general served America poorly. So.
And what role do you think media has played in the election, and do you think it's somewhat usual or unusual?
I'm sorry, what?
What role do you think has media coverage played in the election, and do you feel like it's fairly usual or unusual?
Good question. I did suggest earlier that the 24/7 news cycle, that's kind of a technological, that's been a gradual process, but and as you probably know, Courtney, your knowledge that the media have come under criticism for not quite knowing how to handle Donald Trump. I mean, all the conventional media standards, objectivity, balance, and all, but political scientists don't know how to handle him either. I mean, he really is a remarkable historic phenomenon. Even if he loses by 10, 12%, looking at my students out here, as I sometimes say, your grandchildren are going to say to you someday, there was this guy, Donald Trump, who ran for president back in 2016, and it was a big surprise. He ended up losing to somebody named Clinton, whom I don't know what her name is even. But do you remember that? So I do think he's a remarkable phenomenon, and the media have not done a great job handling that phenomenon, but it's hard to handle new things. And I think any editor of the New York Times or of NBC News and so forth would say, we wish we had another chance. Yeah, it's tough.
As the one holding the microphone, I get to ask one question, which is to go back to your comment a moment ago. You would abolish the primary system, I think is what you said, right?
Yep.
So what would you put in its place? You would have the party elites?
Dues-paying party members. I'd also introduce dues-paying parties. So the Democratic Party of Putnam County, the Republican Party of Putnam County, they would invite people to join. Aren't there these institutions at the poor, I can get the poor, called fraternities and sororities? And don't people join them? And don't people end up paying money to join them, in effect? You get invited to come in, but don't you have to, and you live in the house. So why would Stinebrickner pay money, hypothetically, to join the Republican Party of Putnam County? The answer is because I would then have some say in the nomination. You said, Stinebrickner, pay me $75 a year to come to some meetings, and then when we nominate county commissioners, city mayor for the city, sheriff, and so forth, you're going to have a say. I'd do it. That's the way most of the democratic world works. We're the exception. Hi, Tabitha.
Hi.
You got to speak up. I won't be able to hear you.
Okay, sounds good. What do you think it says about the American public that Donald Trump has been the Republican nominee?
And that he's going to get 35-40% of the vote. People say, oh, it'll be a disaster. But I mean, he's going to get 35-40%. So what do I think? It tells me the American public some of them are, I don't think it tells me anything singular. I think it tells me anything. That some of them are inattentive. Probably some of them are sexist and don't want to have a woman as president. So I mean, I think it's multifaceted why he's going to get. But it also tells me the power of political party affiliation. I think, I mean, it's sometimes said you could, let's think of a year. Well, let's go back to 2008. A guy named Barack Obama became the nominee and won by 11, 12 percentage points, right? In a case where the fundamentals were in his favor. Perfectly good candidate, quite an inspiring candidate. This is not to belittle Obama. It's possible, and this is maybe a stretch, Bruce Stinebrickner could have been the nominee in 2008 and he would have won. I mean, this was just a Democratic year. So, and it's often said sometimes you could run a donkey. You could run a donkey in some years for the Democratic Party, and some years you could run an elephant for the Republican Party. So I think it reinforces how strong party affiliations are. That people just go to the polls and vote. Now, that doesn't quite answer your question how he got to be the nominee, but it does address how he's going to get 35, 40, 45% of the vote. Okay?
So those tuning in online and some of you in the audience may not know that Dr. Stinebrickner is an avid basketball fan. We have a question from Lauren Abendroth.
Who's used to be a basketball player.
Yeah.
But let the record show that she is 0-1 in a challenge 2-on-2 match between she and Emma Ondyke and two old men. They didn't show up. They forfeited. She's down 0-1. I think she's waiting until I get older. I'm in a wheelchair, and then she's going to come.
So Lauren said she really appreciated that part of your lecture when you spoke to the fundamentals and the impact on the nomination process. She wondered if you could apply that same perspective in giving us a little outlook on who you think will win the WNBA this year.
I thought until game one it was going to be Minnesota. They're down 0-1, so I think the fundamentals will say if you're down 0-1 in a 5-game series, probably Nate Silver and Bruce Steinberg would say you got to go with LA now.
Okay, fair enough.
Probably thought I didn't know.
We're going to end on hoops, or do we have one more question here in Watson Forum? Oh, one more question.
In prior conversations, you've said that the debate doesn't matter in the election. It doesn't change.
In general, debates don't matter much.
But
that's right.
What about the debate last night?
Yeah, what about the debate last night? Well, generalizations based on history sometimes fail. All of life, both science, political sciences, you do things on the basis of experience, and you push those experiences forward as if they're still going to apply. So one answer could be last night is a deviation from the norm. But I think there's I don't think it was the debate as much as the debate and in combination with the Friday tape. Take away the Friday tape, I don't think last night's debate. I think the debate more solidified that. I think he was, in a sense, probably unlucky that the debate was coming 2 days later. I think he would have been better off if the debate had been 3 days before the revelation, because I think, but it is, just think, if there hadn't been a debate on Sunday night, would Donald Trump still be slipping in his chances of winning? The answer is yes. The debate, though, I would be the first to concede, augmented that and reinforced it. It's a good question and a so-so answer, I think.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Stinebrickner. We had a lot of political analysis, a little bit of sports tonight. I see a Jake Arrieta Chicago Cubs jersey here in the house, so go Cubbies. And thank you, Dr. Stinebrickner.
Thank you, Steve.